Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure and an honour indeed for me to be here today to talk to this conference. It's appropriate, of course, as has already been said, that this is being held on Europe Day, and the connections and the relationship, as the chairman has just said, between Ireland and Europe and the European project has been very close over many years and continues to be so. And the role of culture in that whole scene is something which is quite fundamental and is indeed recognised. And that, of course, will be part of the agenda, I know, for 2013 when Ireland takes over the presidency of the EU. In several countries in the Union in the last few years there has been attention focused on culture, and particularly on the creative economy and the way in which culture and the economy interact and the contribution that culture makes to the economy. In Cyprus this year, the second half of this year, Cyprus has the presidency of the EU, and I'll be attending and contributing to a forum exactly on this question, culture and the economy, in Nicosia. I think it's in August later this year. And in the last couple of years, in several countries, France, the Czech Republic, Hungary, I've been involved in similar discussions about how culture is related to the economy and to the whole of the European project. In fact, that meeting in Hungary, in Budapest in 2010, I think it was, the first half of 2010, was specifically about the question of culture in the Europe 2020 strategy. The original version, as you may recall, of the Europe 2020 strategy, which is the blueprint for sustainable development of Europe up to the year 2020, contained no reference to culture. And so the Budapest meeting was organised specifically to try to rectify that, and indeed I think it did. And now culture does feature somewhat more prominently in the agenda for the Europe 2020. Also, of course, the interest in culture within Europe is shown through the way in which within the EU itself and the European Commission, the cultural industries, the creative sector, the creative industries has been a matter of concern and interest. There are funds, R&D funds there, and I know, at least I understand, that Ireland hasn't made a great call on those funds yet, and there's a lot of R&D funds there for this very area which can be accessed. It's also, of course, very appropriate that this meeting is being held in Temple Bar, or being organised by the Temple Bar Cultural Trust. I think that it would be true to say that the Temple Bar project, cultural project, has been in some senses a paradigm case of the way in which a historic urban centre can be redeveloped, if that's the right word, with linking the development of the creative economy and the cultural sector. This is a matter which is of relevance not just in developed countries and in large cities like Dublin, but also in the developing world. And in fact, I've been doing some work recently with the World Bank in developing countries on precisely this issue, the role of historic city centres in the urban redevelopment program. The sort of traditional way that the World Bank approaches this in developing countries is to say we need modern buildings, and so we bulldoze all the old buildings which, as the chairman said, like Temple Bar, may be seen as slums or dumps, but in fact, and that's been the sort of, well, not exactly the way ahead, but that's been something that has been very prominent in the agenda, because that's what the urban development people do. And then more recently, I think there's been a recognition that the historic town centres have a lot to offer in terms of the linking of both cultural and economic development. And so to come back to Temple Bar, I think that's exactly what's happened here. The way in which the cultural and the commercial have been developed side by side, as it were, and that is, I think, in some ways a paradigm case that could be used as an example for many modern cities all around the world. My lecture today is about valuation and this of culture, and this in a way continues to be one of the most fundamental issues that we face in looking at the role of culture in the economy and in society. I'm an economist, as you know, but I've been working on the economics of the arts, which is pretty unusual for economists. Most economists are interested in boring things like employment and inflation and so on. You probably know the definition, or one of the definitions of an economist, is somebody who doesn't have sufficient personal charisma to become an accountant, there's a certain amount of truth in that. But I don't go to economics conferences anymore. I much prefer to go to cultural conferences. But the question of value does confront economics and economists with a very real issue, because in fact, as we know, the political agenda, the development agenda is very much oriented, and not surprisingly, towards the economy, towards managing the economy. And so if a sector or an activity doesn't apparently, or may not apparently, contribute all that much to the economy, then it tends to get relegated to the sidelines in the policy agenda. And this has been, I think, in many countries, a problem for the cultural sector, and one in which the cultural sector has to which the cultural sector has responded by trying to get its act together in terms of value and valuation. Is there a way in which we can represent the value that's created by cultural activities that represents more accurately and more realistically the real contribution that culture makes to society, not just to the economy, but to society at large? And so cultural value continues to be a very lively issue. There's a large project just getting underway in the UK, funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council, which is on this very topic, cultural value. That's in a way the sort of rallying cry, the rallying term, cultural value. How do we represent that, and how do we understand it in these contemporary times? So the issues that that I want to talk about are really, well, we could say that the valuation issue comes at three levels. At the macro level, the whole economy. How does the cultural sector contribute to the economy? How do we place a value on that? And that does tend to be, if we're looking at it from the point of view of the economy, that tends to be the value of output, of employment and so on. In other words, the usual macroeconomic indicators. At the micro level, the question arises in relation more specifically to cultural organisations, like indeed the Temple Bar Cultural Trust or any other non-government, NGO, non-profit organisation or creative business that's a small to medium enterprise that's operating within the cultural sector. These are the questions that arise there are, how do we value, again, the contribution that these organisations make to the economy and to society? And the latter point, the contribution to society, is often one of the things which is their primary motivation. Creative businesses are set up in the cultural sector not necessarily to make lots of money, many of them do, but that's not essentially the purpose of a theatre company or a gallery. It's to do something about the art. And that brings me to the last one, of course, the work of individual artists, how to value the contribution that individual artists make to the economy and to society. And again, we're talking about people who do for a living or are professionals in an area that many people regard as a leisure activity, painting, photography, music, writing poetry and so on. These are all things which people do for leisure and as a hobby, and it's sometimes rather surprising to people to find that to be a professional artist is a calling which requires as much training and experience as it does to become a doctor or a lawyer or whatever else. It's and the professional recognition of artists is something which in all countries, and I dare say it's true here in Ireland as well, is a continuing question. I won't say much more about individual artists in my lecture, but if there's questions or comments about that in the discussion, if we have time, let's pursue that there. We have, of course, a problem of terminology straight away when we talk about the arts as an industry or the creative sector or the cultural industries. There's been a debate within the ranks of the cultural policy specialists and so on about, and the policy makers generally, about creative or cultural industries. Should they be called creative industries or cultural industries? And this is not just a purely academic discussion. Actually, I don't like the use of the word academic to mean trivial. Speaking as an academic myself, to use the word academic to mean trivial, as it often is not quite right. I think it's probably means, is this a discussion which just simply goes on in the academy, or is it something which has a real relevance for policy? And of course, it does have a real relevance for policy in many respects. And so it's important, I think, to be clear about the distinction between the creative industries and the cultural industries. And I think it's not difficult to comprehend that there is a distinction if one looks at the adjectives creative and cultural. Creative clearly has a sort of broader sweep in the sense that creativity, whatever that is, extends very widely across the community and the economy. And so if we're going to talk about the creative industries, we would talk about presumably any industries in which creativity is an identifiable input, and that would include things like software. Whereas the cultural industries would be focused on those industries which have something specifically to do with culture, and that wouldn't include, say, things necessarily like software. It's a distinction which has important statistical implications, obviously, because the creative industries extend much further, and so if you want to sort of boost the sort of rhetoric about the creative economy, and you use the creative industries, then you have a much larger contribution to the economy if you include, for example, software, than you do if you just simply talk about the cultural industries which relate to culture. Nevertheless, of course, the fact is that the cultural industries themselves are a significant economic entity, and it's those, I think, which in the context of a discussion about culture and the economy, those are the industries which we need to talk about. But it is an important question, as you would understand, of course, certainly here in Ireland, given the size of the IT sector in this country. The distinction between creative industries and cultural industries would actually make a difference. But from now on, let's talk about the cultural industries, because we're here to talk about culture. And of course, if we're going to say that the cultural industries are those that provide specifically cultural goods and services, it then raises the question, of course, what are cultural goods and services? I think now, again, this is an issue which has been subject to a lot of debate, but I think it's fairly clear now that we can say or fairly clearly agreed, I think it would be true to say, that there are essentially three characteristics of cultural goods and services that are sort of necessary to define them. They require creativity in their manufacture. That's not surprising. They convey some form of symbolic meaning or message through the cultural content that they contain, and that there may be some intellectual property there. It's the second of those which really, in a way, captures the essential characteristic of culture and cultural goods. If you think of a painting, for example, in an art gallery, It's not just a canvas with bits of paint on it. Well, it is that, but it's also something which the painting expresses, and that is something which lifts it out of the realm of just being a purely sort of utilitarian or a purely sort of, if you like, mechanical, physical thing, into something which has a wider sense of its existence. And so that's a distinction that can be made between cultural goods and services and not just ordinary utilitarian goods like the glass of water, which is just simply there for a utilitarian purpose. The question then is, if we define the cultural industries as those producing cultural goods and services, the definition of culture is fairly broad, and it does raise the question more specifically about the creative arts. Now, this is something which has been an issue for discussion in this area for some time, particularly motivated by artists who say, we're not an industry, don't call the arts an industry, we produce art, we're not here to be part of the sort of industrial structure, and if you call the arts an industry, you're somehow or other imposing on it a sense of its commodification, which we would reject, and that's a perfectly valid view. I think, speaking as an economist, it's not difficult to understand that, but nevertheless to say there are industries in the creative arts because there are people who produce things, there are firms that produce things like theatre companies and music ensembles and writers and actors and so on, and all of these together make up an industry, the music industry, the theatre industry, the publishing industry and so on, and it's not difficult to, and there are consumers who buy these products, and so it's not difficult to comprehend that this can be, it's just a matter of terminology really, that this can be seen as being an industry. But the question still remains that in a sort of economically motivated policy agenda, there is a tendency to see the creative arts sort of pushed aside somewhat, and I think that really raises the question of how we conceptualise the notion of the creative arts within this industrial structure, this industrial framework. And my suggestion is that one of the ways in which we can do this, which I think is quite telling, is to see the creative industries, or sorry, I should say the cultural industries, as a series of concentric circles in which the creative arts and creative artists are located right at the centre. And the circles, as we go out, I'll put a diagram up in a minute, represent increasingly commercial industries. They still have some cultural content, but they become increasingly commercial as we go outwards. And let me put this up now straight away. This is it's called concentric circles model of the creative industries, of the cultural industries, and in the middle there are the core creative arts, literature, music, visual arts, and so on. And then the sort of the next layer, which is also really part of the core, filmmaking, museums, galleries, and libraries, which convey immediate cultural services, and then the wider cultural industries, heritage services, publishing, television, so on and so on, and then in the outer circle, when we're getting really much more commercial, there's still a cultural content there, but it's still much more commercial industries, advertising, architecture, design, fashion. These and let me hasten to say that this is not necessarily a sort of watertight structure. There could be sort of variations in the way in which one might want to put it together, but the essential proposition is that the ideas and the skills and the talents that motivate processes of innovation and processes of economic development in other parts of the economy originate in this creative core. And so that's the sort of the essential rationale for this model, is to say that there are creative ideas which are generated by original creative workers. These are even such simple ideas as being ideas in sound, in text, in image, in performance, which are created there and which are developed and taken and used in various ways as they sort of move outwards in some sort of knowledge transfer or diffusion process from the centre out to the outer layers of this diagram, and then into the wider economy at large. And it's not just the ideas, which of course are rather difficult to capture. I mean, ideas are something which are pretty abstract, but nevertheless there's plenty of evidence that this is in fact what happens, but nevertheless something a bit more tangible that can be observed is the movement of creative labour. Creative workers who are trained in the core, who get their training there and who get experience in the core creative industries, move outwards through these circles and move into the broader economy. And there's a lot of data now about creative workers, the structure of the creative workforce, where they work, and so on. And what it can be shown very directly is that the training and the experience which is gained in the core creative arts is relevant even in industries far removed from the cultural sector, like banking and finance and insurance and so on. And you'd be surprised, well, maybe you wouldn't be surprised, that the number of people who would be categorised as creative artists, or at least creative workers, are working in these other industries. So that, I think, is a way in which we can, from the point of view of policy, from the point of view of understanding the nature of what we're talking about, we can get the sort of concepts right. I think this is quite helpful. But let's come back to the question of value. The question of value has been particularly raised in relation to public expenditure by work that's been going on for some time about the notion of what's called public value, which in the broadest possible way can be defined as the value that society as a whole derives from public expenditure. This originated with some people in Harvard Business School back in the 1990s, but it's been developed much more directly in recent times, not just in relation to culture, but in relation to a number of areas of government expenditure, because there's a challenge to conventional cost-benefit analysis, which is the way in which economists traditionally go about evaluating any investment decision or any public expenditure decision. Are the benefits going to be greater than the initial costs, benefits over time? So if you're building an airport, for example, or a freeway, you can quantify, or at least you can predict reasonably accurately, what are going to be the economic benefits through to the future, and you can bring those back to the present. You can say, do they justify the initial capital expenditure for the project? And if you do that for airports or freeways, the calculations and the arguments are reasonably straightforward. If you're looking at areas like culture, it raises this question, well, the economic benefits that are produced, the financial benefits, the direct financial benefits, are only one part of the picture, and if we're going to get the true public value that arises from these sorts of expenditures, then we need to broaden the idea of public value a bit further. And so there's been a lot of work done on questions on measures such as social well-being and even happiness to try to quantify what are some of the broader impacts and effects of these sorts of expenditures. As I said, it's not only just culture that this is relevant to, it's also an area like health, for example. The question of how do you value a human life? You know, this is the sort of issue that arises all the time in terms of, is it worth giving this person a heart transplant if they're only going to live for 5 years and their earning over that time isn't going to be sufficient to justify the cost of the heart transplant? Sorry, you don't do heart transplants, do you? It's some other sort of transplant. Actually, they do heart transplants, don't they? Yes. Things have moved along. Anyway, the I think you get the point, that there are these questions about how do you value these things, and just simply looking at people's earnings into the future as a measure of the value of their life is not entirely satisfactory. I think we'd all agree. So it's not only just in culture, it's in health and other areas as well. Education, for example, environment, these are all areas where this arises. But in relation to the arts and culture, when we're talking about value, I think that a lot of the sort of confusion and the, if you like, misunderstandings and complications of looking at the valuation question can be simplified quite significantly if we just simply think in terms of there are some values which we can measure in financial terms, and we can call those the economic value. That might not necessarily be just the direct financial returns, but also some other ways in which we can represent the benefits in financial terms. I'll come to that in just a moment. But there are these benefits which we could call the economic value, which are all those benefits which we can express in terms of euros or pounds or dollars or whatever unit of currency we are using. That's on the one side. On the other side, we have to understand and we have to accept that there are some values which are created by culture which we can't measure in financial terms, that don't, not just because we haven't sort of worked out how to measure them, but just because it's really just not relevant to try to use a monetary metric to represent the value. I mean, a good example might be one's cultural identity. As the chairman said, you know, Irish identity has perhaps been strengthened, and I would agree entirely with his remarks about that in relation to the EU project generally. Irish cultural identity has probably been strengthened over the last 30 or 40 years, but what value is that to Ireland? Or to Irish, more particularly to Irish people. How do you value your Irish identity, or how do I value my Australian identity? I can't say it's worth, you know, $20 or $100 or something like that. Money is not the metric on which one would try to rate this thing. And yet, one would say it is important. So if things are valued, but they can't be measured in monetary terms, and yet they must be important in some sense, and they'll be important for questions of resource allocation and policy making. And this is the argument, I think, which has to be conveyed, that talking about things like cultural value is not some sort of addition to the discussion about economic value. We just have sort of economic value, and then maybe there's some other things that may be happening down there. But it has in some senses a sort of equal status and should be taken into account, even though we're not in all that good a shape to actually measure it. So let's just look very quickly at these two arms of the argument, the economic value and the cultural value. If we look at the economic value first, we can say straightforwardly, and this is really, in a way, not all that difficult. We're reasonably good at doing this now, at measuring the economic value that's created by the cultural industries. First of all, there's the direct market value of cultural goods and services which are produced, and this we can find if we want to know it for the whole of the Irish economy. We go to the national accounts and we look at the cultural industries, and we add up the value added, or we add up the employment, or we add up the exports, or whatever macroeconomic indicator it happens to be, and we can get a direct measure of the market value which is produced. But in addition, there is also what we would call in economics the public good value. The arts and culture in general produce a public good, which is a good which everybody in some sense enjoys or benefits from, but doesn't pay for directly. You may pay for it indirectly through taxation that provides public goods like roads and traffic lights and police forces and so on. And the arts is no different from that in the sense that it provides public goods which conventionally are seen to be of three sorts, and this follows very much the work that's been done on the public goods created by the environment. There's an existence value, which means that people, and we find this all the time with cultural institutions, people will value the existence of a national gallery, for example, even if they never go there, or that the fact that there's a symphony orchestra in their town or their city, and even though they never attend, they will actually like the thought that it's there, and so that's and they can express a willingness to pay through their taxes for the support of these things, and so that's a valuation of that public good. There's an option demand. If they don't go to the museum or the gallery now, maybe they'd like it still to be there in the future if they want to decide they want to go in the future. And there's a particularly important value attached to just simply passing the culture on to future generations. And so these are all things which are seen as being public goods, and the non-market value, which it's called non-market because there's no market on which these things happen, but we can find out what these values are through fairly well-developed now methods of surveys and so on, that we have to do it properly, but nevertheless you can get a monetary valuation of these things. So we can put those two things together and we get a sort of getting towards the total value of the cultural industries. But there's also this sort of effect that I talked about in the context of the concentric circles model. That is that there is what we would call in economics externalities, but this is just the sort of flow-through effects that may happen, the diffusion of creative ideas, the fact that skills transfer to other industries, and that labour moves. These are all things which contribute to the genuine economic value of the cultural industry. So the economic value side of the picture is reasonably well understood, and we can do this. It's not necessarily all that easy, but we can do it and we know how to do it. In the case of cultural value, it's a different story altogether, because there's no sort of agreed idea of what we mean by cultural value, and I would suggest that we need to cut through this sort of broad term cultural value, the value of culture or cultural value, and try to look at try to disaggregate it, try to sort of deconstruct it, if you like, so that we can be clearer about the components, the things that contribute to cultural value. And there's a list of some of the things. You might interpret this particularly in relation, say, to cultural heritage, the heritage value of the area of the Temple Bar, for example. Aesthetic, spiritual, perhaps, or if you don't want to think of it in terms of heritage, think of it in terms of, say, a painting in the National Gallery or the collection of the National Gallery or something like that. And you can see that there are all of these various components, and this may vary. This is not by any means a sort of complete list or an authoritative list. This is a suggestion of some of the ways in which we might disaggregate or deconstruct the notion of cultural value, so we can get a bit closer to what it actually means for individuals, what it means for society. So that brings us then to questions of measurement, because the next sort of stage of the discussion has to be, okay, it's fine to talk about all these things in principle, but how are we going to actually measure them in a way? And this is particularly important once we get into the policy arena, because the policy makers will say, well, it's okay to bang on about culture and how it has all these sort of contributions to society, but if you can't give me some numbers, or if you can't give me some sort of hard evidence, maybe they might be willing to accept evidence other than quantitative evidence, but nevertheless, if you can't give me the evidence, then we're not really interested. And what we can give them is the evidence about the economic contribution, because we have a convenient means to measure that. We can measure economic value in monetary terms. Everybody knows what a euro means, and so if we can express the total value of the cultural industries in those terms, fine, we know that. But when we come to cultural value, it's got these multiple dimensions, and there's clearly no single unit of account. So how do we go about that process? Well, in the case of economic value, as I've been saying, it's essentially reasonably easy, because I keep saying easy, but it's not all that easy. But I shouldn't make it sound as if it's you just have to go down and sort of click your fingers and there it is. It's one has to do the work, but nevertheless, the observable financial flows, gross value of output, employment, exports, these are available from national accounts. They're available from various sources. They can be put together for the economy. They can be put together for an individual institution. The market value of the goods and services produced by, say, the National Gallery here in Dublin. That can be measured, and we can say this is the economic value which is produced in terms of its market value. We can also look at the non-market value, and that's revealed that's measured by the sorts of techniques which some of you may be familiar with, which economists use. They've been used very much recently in relation to culture as a result of some work that's been done earlier in the environment. As I mentioned, there's a lot of parallels between the notion of environmental benefits and cultural benefits, and it relates to the parallels between natural capital, which is all the sort of natural resources which, like air and minerals and so on, that we depend on. So natural capital and cultural capital. I don't mean cultural capital in the sociological sense, I mean cultural capital in the economic sense, meaning that culture is an asset which generates benefits, both economic and cultural. So the ways in which environmental economists have assessed the value of the environment for intangible things like the beauty of a landscape or something like that are not quite directly, but are very closely paralleled by the ways in which culture and cultural facilities, say heritage, for example. Much of this work has been done in relation to heritage that generates the same. It's an asset which generates these sorts of benefits, and these economic benefits, like bequest value and existence value, can be measured, and the methods that we have are becoming increasingly sort of sophisticated in methodological terms, particularly contingent valuation, choice modelling. Some of you may know about these things. And what that means, to put a sort of bottom line on it, is to say that we're reasonably competent either for the economy at large or for cultural institutions and enterprises within the economy and subsectors to measure these economic benefits and the economic value. When it comes to cultural value, as I've been saying, there's no unit of account. We're not really very clear exactly yet about how we should measure it. There's quite a bit of work going on at the moment in the sort of the academic areas and so on, at trying to appreciate how to do this in a way which is going to be convincing to policymakers particularly. There's work going on, for example, in UNESCO about cultural indicators, trying to get together sets of data about the nature of the culture, the cultural sector, and so on. This is called the Cultural Indicators Suite, which is mainly focused, so far at least, on developing countries, but nevertheless, the idea of indicators, as distinct from a single measure, the idea of a series of indicators is one way to go. Expert appraisal, meaning that there are some people who are specialists in culture in one way or another, artists or historians or whatever, and their opinion counts. They can presumably make informed decisions. So in relation to heritage, for example, is a historic building which is in the path of an airport runway, should that be preserved, or is it to be demolished? Well, how can we put some sort of value, some sort of cultural significance measure onto that building to weigh against the economic benefits, presumably, of demolishing it? And the opinions of experts who know about this thing, rather than just the general public. I don't want to be dismissive of the general public, but there are sort of specialist knowledge which may contribute to these decision-making processes, so expert appraisal is important. But we also do have to understand that public expenditure derives from the taxes that we pay, and so it's the preferences of the public are not irrelevant by any means, and it's at least useful to know what they are. And so there's a whole series of efforts going on to try to understand public preferences for various cultural phenomena. And that's something which, as I say, this is work in progress. And if we were having this discussion in, say, 20 years' time, I think the discussion would be rather different, because I think by that stage the work would have progressed to the point where we can say something much clearer, much more clearly about the nature of cultural value. In fact, if you'd like to organise in 20 years' time, I'll come back and give the same lecture again, and you'll see it'll be quite a different lecture, maybe a sort of more, a bit more sort of positive about this notion of cultural value and about the way in which we measure it. But we're getting there. I mean, this is a slow process, and I think that that we have to sort of keep going. One of the important issues in relation to cultural value is that we have to say whose value are we talking about, and there is an important distinction here between the value to the individual and the value to society. Now, when we talk about economic value, when we've got the measure of the euro, we don't sort of bother too much about this, because a euro is a euro, whether it's owned by an individual or whether it's owned by the economy, as it were. But when we're talking about cultural value, the perception of what cultural value is on behalf of an individual, how much does culture mean to me, is something which is sort of purely individual to me. And as far as an economist is concerned, a neoclassical economist, that's all that matters. You know, this is Mrs. Thatcher's remark about there's no such thing as society. You know, it's all just made up of what individuals think. But there is, I think, something which we could say about what's the value to society. And I think people can actually say, and we've done some work on this, which I could talk about if you like, on valuations of paintings in an art gallery, about people's valuation for themselves, and valuations saying, well, look, I don't really particularly like this painting, but I would think it's important that it should be in our National Gallery, and so I can see that it has social importance. So the distinction between the cultural value for the individual and the cultural value for society is something which perhaps should be borne in mind. Okay, let me just move on finally to the question of new technologies. Connor said at the beginning that I would talk about the Nesta work that we did. Well, I will, but only fairly briefly. This was work that I did a couple of years ago with a colleague in Nesta, the National Endowment for Science, Technology and the Arts, which is no longer an endowment. It's been transformed into a charity, so it's just called Nesta now, without those letters meaning something. We did this work on new technologies in cultural institutions, and how should cultural institutions adapt to the new technological environment in which we now live. And the two aspects which are important to this question are, first of all, the question of consumption technologies. How is the whole process of cultural consumption changing? And I don't need to stress this. We all know that new technologies, particularly on the young, well, you know, we're all young relatively, but even younger, let's say, the use of particularly mobile telephony and the other sort of means of convergence, communications convergence, are really having an effect on the way in which people receive their cultural messages. And so the new technologies, consumption technologies, is important, and the way in which the new technologies impact on cultural organisations. And again, many of these impacts we know quite well. The ones that we looked at in the case of the Tate and the National Theatre were, in the case of the Tate, how do museums and galleries use online transmission of exhibitions in order to improve their sort of reach? And in the case of the National Theatre, we did the same thing with their NT Live, the National Theatre Live performance. And so this has led to new business models for arts and cultural enterprises, which particularly focus on the middle one of those three things, online market development, the development of online services by cultural institutions, cultural enterprises, whether they're large like the National Gallery or small to medium enterprises, these are the ones. And this is my last slide, and it's very appropriate that the Minister arrives just as I talk about cultural policy, and I won't dwell on it, but I think that there are implications for the policy-making process from everything that I've been talking about, and in particular in the notion of the full appreciation of the market and the non-market value of the arts and culture, which we don't always necessarily take into account, and the importance of cultural value as a component of the public value that's created by the cultural sector. Thanks very much.